Got it. All right. We're being recorded. Thank you, Oscar. Again, my name is Shiva Sabati, she or they pronouns. I also, in addition to supporting Lessons in Liberation, organize with a collective called LAPES, the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society, Abolitionist University Studies Collective, and I currently teach at California State University, Sacramento. All right, let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So a quick session overview, which is the title of this slide. And the slide also includes an image of the cover of Lessons in Liberation. We're going to start with situating the book, Lessons in Liberation, the toolkit, and also a bit of the story of how it came to be. From there, we'll move on to a panel discussion to hear from some of our contributors of Lessons in Liberation. We'll also have an activity from the toolkit, and then we'll close out with a collective conversation with everyone that is here in the space with us. So with that, I'll pass it on to Farima.
Thank you, Shiva. So to get us started, it's important to situate our work with Lessons in Liberation within the larger context of the prison industrial complex. So on the screen, what you'll see is an image created by Critical Resistance, which helps us to understand that the prison industrial complex is a term coined by Angela Davis to describe how the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment are used as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Now, Lessons in Liberation became a collaboration between these two grassroots coalition networks that joined forces to organize abolitionist learning and efforts to dismantle the prison industrial complex. So one is the National Education for Liberation Network, and the other is Critical Resistance. Education for Liberation is a national coalition of folks who seek to build alliances that cross boundaries of geography, occupation, and age to nurture communities of shared purpose, which is to organize for education for the purpose of liberation from all forms of oppression. Critical Resistance is a national coalition of folks who seek to build an international movement to dismantle the prison industrial complex, which is shaped by the belief that providing human needs and basic rights are what make communities secure and safe. Now, this slide includes images of educators and organizers affiliated with several grassroots collectives at an abolition and education convening in Oakland, California. Since 2016, the Education for Liberation Network has partnered with Critical Resistance to bring together prison abolitionists and critical educators in dialogue to learn from each other. And as abolitionist educators, we believe that teachers have much to learn from the radical and historical viable stance that abolitionists hold, and that prison abolitionists would be served to better understand the everyday ways in which our schooling system feeds the logic of the carceral system. Our sustained commitments led to our efforts in sharing our work in community settings and platforms to ensure that a range of education stakeholders had access to these conversations and concepts in generative and meaningful ways. And so these collaborations eventually led to our collective developing the Lessons in Liberation multimedia toolkit that documents how educators and young people and organizers and communities are building and practicing abolition in their schools and in their neighborhoods. This slide includes headshots of some of the core members of our editorial collective, Chrissy A.Z. Hernandez, Erica R. Miners, myself, Farima Porkhorshid, Carla Shalaby, Thomas Nikundiwe, may he rest in peace, Stephanie Tabtom, Corey Green, Alex Davis, Stefan Shack Bellevue, Emily Bautista, and Emily Borg, and of course the AK Press logo. This slide includes images of flyers from our 8 webinars over the past 2 years, as well as the caption, "All webinars are accessible via the Education for Liberation and Critical Resistance YouTube pages." As the collective was working on the toolkit in 2020, we pushed back the publication timeline to give some space and honor the differential impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the acceleration of state-sanctioned violence against Black folks. And at the same time, there was a growing national conversation around defunding police, a result of the tireless organizing of abolitionists and the accelerated movement for Black lives. And so given the political moment, we saw it as an important opening to bring folks into dialogue around abolition and abolitionist possibilities in connection to education. So we organized a series of webinars, the first in early of June 2020, with the intention of uplifting that long trajectory of anti-racist work and abolitionist organizing that had preceded and created the possibility for this political moment in which conversations around abolition were entering into the national discourse. And the series extended into 2021 and across both years. Our panelists included folks from a range of educational, grassroots, and geographical contexts, including K-12 educators, teacher educators, young folks, school administrators, community organizers, teacher labor union organizers, parents, activist scholars, and folks who have multiple and many other roles. And the conversations facilitated in the webinars speak to the deep and broad ways that abolition has guided folks to transform classroom spaces, their schools and communities. And we also wanted to learn from both the successes and the quote, failures of long fought organizing struggles. And so in organizing the webinars, we intentionally centered formerly incarcerated folks and people most directly impacted by the prison industrial complex as part of our abolitionist praxis. And we also included ASL translation and live captioning so that the webinars would be accessible to members of our community who are also part of the deaf and hard of hearing communities. And the webinars can be accessed on both the Education for Liberation Network's YouTube page and also the Critical Resistance YouTube page. And they're part of the Toolkit project. And to date, there's over 150,000 views across all of these webinars. So our intentions was to highlight practical, accessible, concrete, and inspiring pieces that would support young people, educators, organizers, and communities to come together to build and practice abolition in their schools and other learning spaces, as well as in their neighborhoods and communities. And so with the hope to draw in a wide range of learners and teachers, those newer to abolition, educators grappling with the practices, the groups trying to deepen their collective work. We included examples and analysis of grassroots campaigns, of first-person narratives about curricular projects, arts, music, and descriptions about restorative, healing, indigenous, and transformative justice practices in classrooms. So Lessons in Liberation has pieces from over 35 educators and organizers and includes different narratives and dialogues that center education for liberation. Curriculum, tools such as the California Immigrant Youth Justice Collective about abolishing ICE, or Harper Keenan's piece that speaks to reimagining classroom management as community building, and campaigns such as Oscar's Project What's Bill of Rights for the children of incarcerated parents. These pieces push the abolitionist agenda while also being deeply rooted in everyday experiences and conditions, and they capture abolitionist works in progress that are happening by, for, and with pre-K-12 and community-based educators. Taken together, the collection aims to generate dialogue and energize practices across the nation, and to elevate and connect politically urgent past and current abolitionist work. So I want to read an excerpt from the introduction to Lessons in Liberation that speaks to the values that guide this grassroots abolitionist learning model. Which was written by our comrade, Dr. Carla Shalaby. This toolkit is an invitation to invest in education that nourishes our communities and is committed to organizing to abolish carcerality and other manifestations of the prison industrial complex in our schools and beyond them. We believe our guiding values here because we believe that we explain our guiding values here because we believe that those who are committed to abolition must also share and be steeped in these values and how they work and how they live. And so we use these values to suggest how we hope people will and will not engage in this work. So first, we have to understand that abolition is a collective struggle. We have to get our people. We hope that educators who pick up this toolkit do so with the knowledge that this is a resource for collective mobilization and struggle, not for individual professional development. Abolition is specific. We have to recognize its distinction. We specifically reject the idea of throwaway people and the capitalist logic that authorize this disposability. Abolition is not a theme, an abstract idea, a slogan, or a metaphor for all things social justice. It's not a newer term for or form of culturally responsive teaching. It isn't the next evolution of anti-racist teaching. Though abolitionist education is culturally sustaining, anti-racist, and committed to social justice, it's not to be used interchangeably with these terms because abolition is specific in its focus and its demand. Abolition is about the particular and urgent need to get rid of systems of policing, surveillance, and prisons, and to build alternatives that make us truly safe. As we move the work of abolition into school spaces, we worry about distancing it from organizing struggles to end the prison industrial complex, of which schools are very much a part. We worry about obscuring its particularity and the concrete demand it makes. Abolition is specific only to those educational and other efforts that concretely dismantle the prison industrial complex and that build and sustain humane practices of safety based in love and care. Abolition is actionable. This is more than a reading exercise. Abolition is far too urgent to be treated as an intellectual or theoretical learning exercise. Abolition is actionable, and we hope that those engaging this work will do so with an eye toward action. We do fear hasty action that does more harm than good. And because we value thoughtful, strategic engagement, we draw people toward collective and solidarity work led by those most directly familiar with and affected by the prison industrial complex. Abolition is also about who you are. So we have to do the internal work required. Those engaging this toolkit and movement, regardless of identity, will need to do the kind of serious internal work that requires honest self-reflection and self-evaluation. Those most removed from the everyday realities of the prison industrial complex, those not directly impacted by its harms and violence in daily life, will need to do the most difficult and rigorous internal work. We must each look at ourselves to locate and root out our common sense attraction to punishment, our own investments in the maintenance of the prison industrial complex, and our tendency to want to protect ourselves and our own, even at the expense of others. And lastly, abolition is about how we live in relation to others. We have to work, do, and be in right relation. Abolitionist educators recognize that we are on colonized land. Decolonization is tangible, and abolitionists are interested in the return of homelands to Indigenous communities. Abolitionist educators work in solidarity with and in movement led by those most vulnerable to, familiar with, and directly affected by the prison industrial complex. Abolitionist educators recognize intersectionality and interconnection. We believe our own stories are spaces from which to build relationships of healing, communities of care, and collective movements for justice. Abolitionist educators distinguish accountability from punishment, leveraging transformative justice and other forms of community accountability to strengthen safety, repair relationships, and educate harm. Abolitionist educators resist the culture of extraction that requires taking. Instead, we understand relationships are reciprocal. Abolitionist educators struggle to live, work, do, and be in right relation with others at all times. There is alignment between what they espouse and what they actually model. Abolitionist educators must first be abolitionist human beings. I want to invite Aja and Oscar to engage in some discussion, and I'm going to bring Shiva Savati back to moderate this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fadi. Thank you so much for grounding us. All right, so we want to invite Aja and Oscar, both of whom are contributors to Lessons in Liberation, and we're going to have some conversation. So we'll start out with question 1, which is here on the slide. Can you talk about your work in relation to abolition and education? And connectedly, what are the abolitionist visions of education that are at the center of your work? So Aja, could we start with you?
Absolutely. So once again, good afternoon, everyone. So I love this question, and I was thinking a lot about one, how to rethink about another term other than work, because I feel like work is so tied to capitalism, right? So I'm trying to think this through of like my commitments or my engagements, right, and in community. And so it looks a few different ways, right? And I said, as I introduced myself, I had these different hats that I feel like are very much embodied and part of me, right? As an educator, as a healer, as an artist, as an activist. And so my work kind of overlaps in that way. And so, or my commitments overlap in that way. And then particularly, my political home is A Long Walk Home, which is an organization in Chicago that is committed to healing, activism, and art, particularly to dismantle or work against gender violence. And it works with Black girls ages 12 to 18. I would even say more expansive than that, because there's a lot of community work that happens outside of just the institutional, the work that we do with our Leadership Institute that includes young Black girls in Chicago from ages 12 to 18. So that's one of my political homes, as well as Ed for Liberation and doing Free Mind Free People every 2 years, and that connection and that work and organizing with teachers. But so I see my work alongside of doing research, right? Because I am a researcher, and really thinking about examining through a more critical lens, what are the needs of our community? And so really trying to rethink what research is, right? And something that we've already been doing in our communities. We're often asking these tough questions. We're also often trying to figure out answers and solutions to the things that are in our communities, that are happening in our homes. So I'm a researcher, right? And so part of this work is me researching. And at the core of my work is doing work around with Black girls. And that looks a few different ways of both thinking about the school to prison nexus and these ties between school and prison, but also all the things in between, right? Of how Black girls are also navigating going through communities and all these other spaces that they also enter and go through. And so in this conversation, within that research, particularly through an intersectional lens, right, I'm able to also see all these other areas of how throughout society we are navigating the school to prison nexus. And so working with them to not only see that, you know, giving name and being able to articulate our experiences within this context of the school to prison nexus, but also what it means to look at things they're already doing and things they want to cultivate and challenging or engaging their radical imagination for things they want to see in the world. And so that's what that looks like when I'm with A Long Walk Home, and the many things that we do that is centered around gender violence, but over the years really expanding the ways that we've been talking about gender violence. That includes state violence, that includes community violence, that has a racial justice lens, but also allows us to see what else is on the other side, right? And so in doing that in community and with our girls. And then also thinking about how I'm teaching. I'm a teacher educator. And so students who take classes with me, right, is a lot of deep reflection work. Many students will say when they take my class, it's not the content that's hard, but it's literally the deep reflecting that I'm consistently walking us through together to think about our work and our pedagogies as teachers. And particularly one of the hardest questions that I feel like my students deal with from the time we start class till we end is when we're forming our community agreements. I ask, what is accountability without punishment? And I consistently ask them to work through that throughout the whole semester as we talk about whether it's classroom management, when we're talking about content, when we're talking about engaging with families, when we're talking about engaging with our students and engaging with the larger school community, right? And this is a consistent question that we deal with around what is accountability, particularly as much as we see it and hear people talk about it, really pushing us to name what are we talking about when we say accountability, and can we see this outside of the gaze of the prison industrial complex. And so those are just a few of the ways that I'm engaged in this work, whether it's in Chicago and Detroit, and with this larger community of critical activists and teachers and educators, part of these different networks, particularly Education for Liberation. And then the second question, what are the abolitionist visions of education that are at the center of your work? And it's really thinking about, one, I don't think I have like this, I can see it, right? And I don't have an answer, this like very easy answer of how do I get to the vision. But what I do know is most important in this work is that we really reclaim some things from our ancestors, from our ancestral wisdoms. For me, it has included doing a lot of even studying of what freedom schools were and what were happening in freedom schools and what it meant to have Black teachers and Black schooling at a time in this country. As well as it means, what does it mean that we even have space to collectively come together and reflect and engage in praxis, engage in political study, and within the spaces that we're creating outside of maybe schools, outside of this this white gaze, right? How do we within those spaces begin to engage in practices of freedom of what we imagine the world to be, right? So recreating our values with ourselves, with the folks we're in community with, and just really trying to, in this now, not waiting for freedom, but creating freedom in the ways that we can in this current landscape. And so those are just some of the things that I'm doing in my work, but also thinking through consistently in my personal life as I'm in community with folks, that carries with me into each space I go in and each hat that I carry.
Aja, thank you for starting us this part of the conversation off so powerfully. Some folks are, Chrissy's uplifting that brilliant question, what is accountability without punishment? I just want to uplift a few other things you've offered us, like thinking about our commitments rather than work, to decouple what is like a project of liberation from capitalist logics, thinking through political homes, reframing your identity as research, and the sort of like research that is always going on in the community and asking what are the needs of our community and creating those solutions. So just to shine light on some of the wisdom that you've offered us, and also to invite folks as you're hearing things resonate with you that you want to uplift, punctuate, right? Go ahead and drop it into the chat. All right, so Oscar, same questions to you. Can you talk about your work in relation to abolition in education? And then what are the abolitionist visions of education that are at the center of your work?
Yeah, thank you both. So again, my name is Oscar. I am the program manager for a program called Project What, which specifically works with a youth ages 12 to 18, and we're hopefully expanding to 18 to 26 soon. Within the Bay Area, so Oakland, California, Alameda County, Contra Costa County, and San Francisco County, which is basically what makes up all of the Bay Area. And we focus a lot on youth engagement, youth development, and professional development for youth while getting paid and providing stipends for our youth because they go out and train and do presentations to counselors, teachers, and really anyone who's a service provider on how to be better adult allies and how to have better support for youth who have gone through parental incarceration. So to answer the first question, what's it called? I would say, so I myself am not a teacher, but I am an educator. I would say we go through this phase in our program where we are teaching our youth the history of incarceration, looking at how incarceration has shifted from slavery to what is now jails and prisons, to prison labor, to looking into a lot of how same system is just different. It comes in different ways. And so when it comes down to abolition and education, what we like to, or what I like to say is that the effects of incarceration don't stop with the person who's incarcerated. It doesn't stop with the adults who are in relation to the person who's incarcerated. It comes a lot towards the youth as well. And that's a population that's usually oftentimes forgotten, is the youth. So youth whose parents are incarcerated, youth whose siblings are incarcerated, they're kind of always an afterthought of who really is affected by incarceration. When we talk about a lot of the resources, whether it's here in California or outside, the majority of resources are aimed towards the adults who do have an incarcerated loved one, which is not to knock off them out, because I mean, that's what's needed right now. But the support stops at them. You know, it doesn't continue with the youth. It doesn't continue with providing a space for youth to even just talk about their experience as having someone who's incarcerated. And so with abolition and education, one of the ways that I show that in my program is really prioritizing what Fatima has said earlier, is this work called the Children of Incarcerated Bill of Rights, which is 8 rights that we feel like every child of an incarcerated parent should have and should always be honored, and should be honored through actual legislation as well, to make it known that it should be respected. And some of the rights that are included I have the right to be heard when decisions are made about me, or I have a right to speak with, see, and touch my parent. I have the right to be kept safe and informed at the time of my parents' arrest. I have a right to a lifelong relationship with my parent. And so a lot of these rights are often overlooked. And we help our youth advocate for themselves and advocate for other youth and advocate for youth who aren't able to be in spaces like Project What. There's not a lot of organizations or a lot of programs that prioritize youth voice, who prioritize youth-led programs. And so that's really what Project What is, and my work is really providing the space for youth to, one, be youth, but also be able to go out, advocate for themselves, really be able to call out the systems that have put their loved ones and that they don't have access to their loved ones, really being able to learn the history of why things are the way that they are, but also be critical of these systems, be critical of the solutions that have been presented, really be critical of westernized versions of the solutions that have been put in place, such as like restorative justice, really looking at what it really came from and to how it's being presented. Same thing with like being critical or seeing how it's similar, but it's also different between restorative and transformative justice, really being able to know the history, knowing and being able to explain it, but also looking at it, how it affects them, how it affects people who have been incarcerated, how it affects allies, how it affects basically everyone and everything. Like I said, incarceration and the effects of incarceration don't stop at the people who are incarcerated. It's levels to it, you know? And so with the second question, what are my visions of education that are the center of my work, really is just providing space for youth, really being able to be a tool for youth here in the Bay Area and outside of the Bay Area as well, in terms of being able to call everyone out, you know, having, breaking down the power dynamics between an adult and a youth, being and allowing youth to feel comfortable calling me out if they need to, calling everyone out, calling out politicians, calling out other people who are service providers, really being able to provide the space in order to feel comfortable enough to use their voice and see the power of their voice when calling it out. I think with the rights that I have, with some of the rights that I shared, a lot of it tries to center youth voice. And we're in this time in the world where everyone is using their voice, but no one's really listening, right? And we always say this thing where the youth are the future of our generations, or we're the ones they're supposed to look at, but no one is really listening. So really my vision is just being able to provide the space, and at one point not having a need for Project What, not having a need for programs that are focusing on providing resources for those who are incarcerated. And really just, like I said, being able to put our youth in the forefront and really allowing the adults to take a step back and know what that is, and creating and breaking down the power dynamics between youth and adults, and what youth need to tell adults and adults listening just in general. So kind of all over the place, but I think a lot of my work revolves around just youth engagement and what that putting the youth in the front of a lot of the movements that we have been endlessly working at creating.
Thank you so much, Oscar, for sharing about your work through Project What. I think it's really powerful to think about this really powerful model of supporting youth-led organizing, which, as you said, you know, these are young people teaching adults about how they can be better adult allies. And I really appreciate this wisdom of, you know, we talk about youth being the future, but are we listening, right? So thank you for entering that into this space and just sharing about, you know, I think all that you shared really uplifts the sort of political education that is always happening beyond the kind of confines of schools and schooling. So thank you so much for uplifting that as well. I think we'll move to our second question, which I'll read now. What is a practice that you have facilitated with youth, excuse me, that reflects how you build this work, or a practice from the toolkit that you've engaged? So why don't we switch up? Oscar, could you get us started actually?
Yes. So a practice that I've facilitated, or something that was included in the toolkit, I would say, is building a lot of the work around the Children of Incarcerated Bill of Rights. Every summer we have this program, part of 8-week training where the new cohort of youth come in, where they are able to write a 2 to 3 page story, narrative, spoken word piece on what it's like to be a child incarcerated parent. And with this work in terms of just writing and healing and starting their healing journey, we incorporate one of these rights in these writings to really capture and show people that these rights, again, should be honored. They're important for everyone and everything, to really be able to understand that even though we think it's common sense, we think it's simple, it's not. You know, some people really don't see these things as achievable. And we really want to highlight the importance of, again, not just knowing the incarceration system, but what are the solutions that have been presented and how to be critical of those, but also being critical of some of the things or some of the work that we've done and how to push forward and how to advocate with just youth voice. Like, I think one of the things in terms of education and abolition is really understanding that youth voice should be enough. There shouldn't be questions, there's no ifs, buts, and ands. At the very minimum, youth voice and what their experience is and them talking about their experience should be enough. And so really prioritizing and including the Bill of Rights and including that as kind of the groundwork of our program, Project What, and the groundwork, a lot of what we do in terms of advocating, in terms of going out, in terms of presentations and workshops, is really highlighting these rights, really being able to go out and, again, put in youth at the forefront with them, telling everyone their experiences and what they're needing and what their needs are and how their needs should be met by these service providers, and kind of putting on the spot and really going with the reflection of like, what Asia was saying on like, how does accountability look like? Like, this is a question that is always asked, and it provides the conversation, the starting point of a conversation and the starting point of a healing journey and the starting point of decolonization mindset as well, like decolonizing what you really think of accountability and punishment. And I think with these rights, it really causes people to question how youth have been thought about, but also, again, the effects of incarceration outside of the person who's incarcerated.
Thank you, Oscar. And I think just in the interest of time, I won't summarize, but just pass the mic over to Aja.
Sure. So I wanted to draw attention. So I wrote my piece in the toolkit is I Know Why the Cage Bird Doesn't Sing. Creating a healing space for Black girls to reclaim their bodies. And I wanted to just bring attention to that because the work that I do is sensitive, being that I'm working with folks who are either survivors or been witnesses of some type of gender violence in their lives, or often comes because they're coming for a friend. They want to know how to be a better friend to someone who disclosed something to them. And so each piece of how we go through the programming and activities oftentimes like can trigger different events and trauma and things that some of the girls experience. And so we always are trying to think of like with every piece of the programming activity of how do we make sure it's healing informed. And so I was just thinking about that. And so one of my favorite activities to do with the girls as we are actually preparing, I'm joining them this summer. And so we're like in a week about to get ready to be together in a hotel for a retreat. And so one of my favorite that I talk about in here is the art sharing that we do. And so the program for the summer is usually 4 weeks, but we do a retreat that's like an overnight retreat for like 4 days. And during that time, one of the first activities, well, we do a few activities during the day, but like one of our first activities for that night of the first night is an art sharing circle. And so we put a lot of thought and intentionality around setting up the circle. So between the aromatherapy smells that are happening in the room, from having pillows to having tissues, to making sure the space is comfortable in all the different ways, to having different things the girls can touch and play with as a part of grounding themselves. Because this is the first time that many of the girls are sharing something vulnerable with each other and getting to know each other, but it's also us as adults participating and sharing something vulnerable with them. And so we usually come into the space and everyone has been told ahead of time to bring a piece of art that they created to share with the group. And this is also their introduction to the group as an artist, right? And for many of us who engage in art, it comes from a very deep and spiritual place of us trying to work through things, us trying to reimagine something, us reflecting on something. And so it's a really heavy, we already can feel the heaviness when you come into the space, but it's such an important bonding moment for setting the stage for the rest of the summer for us. And as the girl, you know, like I said, they're usually sharing about how they come to this art, but it's also something personal. They're usually sharing about how they come to their art. And this is one of the activities that really stands out for me as I think about what it means for us to engage in abolition, as I think about what it means to engage in community, especially as folks who often can be positioned as the expert, of what it means to continue to come in spaces and ask people to give something, but also being someone who makes sure that you're also giving something. And so this has really just been a push for me in thinking about vulnerability and how much that is so critical to how we're building community, how we can reimagine the difference of our relationships with one another. And so I think that really shifts the space also in us already trying to shift a hierarchy of adult and youth, right? That they also too get to see us in our most vulnerable moment and who we are, and why we're coming to this work, why we want to be in this relation to them, right? But also that we also aren't just folks who are perfect or who haven't experienced anything, right? And so I talk about this on page 287 if people want to go read it, and you can see more about how we just engage in the art sharing space.
Thank you, Aja. And I just appreciate how across both of your examples, like the arts and writing and that kind of relationship building was really at the center of what you shared. And it also connects somewhat to the next component of what we wanted to offer folks today. So I'll pass the mic on to Chrissy to facilitate the activity.
Thank you both for all the wisdom that you shared and for your beautiful pieces in the toolkit. As Shiva mentioned, I'm going to continue on this theme of creative practice by sharing a piece that's in the toolkit from the Knotted Line. I just put the link in the chat. And so I'm going to share a bit of what's in the toolkit and then how I've used it in the classroom. And then we're going to practice that together. And we're going to do all of that in like 15 minutes, and it's going to be great. So this slide reads Artifacts from the End of the Prison Industrial Complex by Evan Bissell at the top, and text describing workshops, which I'll share in just a moment. On the right is a cover of the Knotted Line curriculum, which includes photos of historical figures cut into strips and overlaid with one another on a maroon background and an old book spine with the words, "The Knotted Line." As I mentioned, this workshop is part of the Knotted Line curriculum. You can learn more at knottedline.com. The Knotted Line is a teaching resource that includes an interactive timeline and curriculum. I really recommend checking it out. It's pretty incredible. The activity that I'll share today is from the artifacts from the end of the PIC curriculum, which is offered as 2 scaffolded sessions. The first focuses on personal connection and reflection, terms and theory, and identifying problems. And the second invites students to integrate concepts and represent new knowledge in their voices. So again, I'm going to share just one activity from this larger workshop sequence. And then I'll also mention that it's important to kind of understand the first workshop piece. And also, as I share what I've done, there's a lot of work that happens kind of before this activity as well. All right, so we're going to go to the next slide. Great. So at the top of this slide, it reads Artifacts from the Future, and I'll describe the images as we go along. I have facilitated this activity with high school students as part of a larger course on abolition and the prison industrial complex to spark our radical imaginations. And as I mentioned, we're going to try it together today. In this activity, students are asked to imagine that it is 50 years in the future, and they are historians who have discovered a key artifact that helped end the prison industrial complex. Students then are asked to represent this artifact in some way. In my case, I asked students to create the artifact and to write a paragraph that explained why they believe it is a key to ending the PIC. So on the right, I'm going to ask you to click yes, and then one more time. Great, thank you. So on the right, there are two pictures of student created artifacts. At the top is a medical robot made out of gray construction paper with a red cross on its belly that provides free and quality medical care to all. And below it is a permanent residency card that enables the holder, in this case, the student described all people, to travel freely across borders. Other student artifacts have included a Polaroid camera that shows the person in the photo as their liberated selves, free from the PIC's oppressive tentacles, and a record player that cleanses the listener of racist thoughts. And you can click one more time. Great, thank you. So after teaching this a few times, I found that I wanted to dig deeper into the histories and genealogies of the PIC and to support students in a more incremental and collective understanding of social change. So we created this timeline. In this photo is a piece of blue tape lining the wall of the classroom, which acted as a timeline. And there are pieces of paper above it and paper hanging on a clothesline to the right. The events taped down are those that have happened that we learned about in class. So for example, convict leasing is up there, as is the founding of the organization Critical Resistance. To the right, papers are on a clothesline to denote that they are in the future and consist of organizing strategies and events that we imagined will happen over the next 50 years to dismantle the PIC. So we focused on these community organizing strategies so that we can hold the tangibleness of social change rather than only create objects separated from that relational collective action that is at the heart of change. And today we're going to be digging into these future artifacts. And we're going to try this out, but briefly. So this slide has the prompts, which I'll read in a moment, and the cover of the knotted line curriculum. So the prompts is being pasted into the chat. If somebody can paste that in, I can do that as well. And I will read it now. I can grab it too, y'all. 1 second. All right. Okay, you beat me. All right. So great. So I will go ahead and read it now. Imagine it is 50 years in the future and you are a historian. You've just discovered a key artifact that helped end the prison industrial complex. For example, maybe you found a letter from a movement leader that outlined their political strategy, or a photo from a meeting, or glasses that made visible the impacts of the PIC everywhere, or a lotion that heals the trauma of imprisonment, or a hologram that allows families to stay in contact even when incarcerated. Imagine big. Don't worry about technical limitations. Invent something totally new. So I'm now going to ask you to just spend 5 minutes imagining an artifact in the future. You can write it down, draw it, think about it, or come up with another way to represent your idea. One place to start is to think about an issue related to the PIC and then come up with an artifact that addresses that issue. So for example, the criminalization of immigrants and the card that allows everyone to freely travel across borders. So in a moment, we're just going to ask for a couple folks to share out. So I'm going to give us about 5 minutes to do this work and we will come on back. All right, I know that time passed very quickly, but I'm wondering if we could get a couple volunteers to share any artifact that you thought of, so that can be in the chat, or you can unmute yourself as well. Love this. So Patricia wrote, in 2072 in Phoenix, Arizona, a microphone was found that after inspection was found to only deliver no votes about further funding the nation's most deadly force. And when the agenda item came up about defunding the Phoenix Police Department, it was a unanimous yes. Love that. Love that artifact. Thank you. Can we get maybe one more volunteer? You can raise your hand if you'd like to unmute, or can go in the chat. Yes, thank you. All right. It's all good. I'm tempted to cold call on one of my co-panelists, but I will not do that. Instead, I will go ahead and thank you for exploring this activity with us. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Shiva, who's going to facilitate our collective discussion.
I think I just saw a brave hand come up. Was it Hemi? Hemi, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was typing, but I'll just say it.
Great.
I just thought about in Star Trek, you know, the different like species can understand each other because there's a language translator. So I just imagine there's a conversation filter that translated what I was thinking into the education system administrators' language and their peripheral support, so they don't feel attacked or defensive or alarmed.
I love that. I love that. Love that. I feel like we could use a lot of kinds of translators these days. 100%. Thank you so much for sharing. Wonderful. And I see that Okaikor is said a water filter that not only cleansed our water, but our negative and deadly ideological orientations. Yes, love that as well. Thank you all for sharing. And they're still coming. So a cookbook with recipes that helps to transform the lessons of and from those affected by the PIC to ending oppressions in all its forms. I love that. Thank you so much. I have to say, this is one of my favorite activities to do. And you can imagine the kind of gallery walk with students, right? When they're looking at each other's objects and seeing what they come up with. It's really incredible. All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Shiva.
Well, thank you, everyone. I guess actually I want to invite everyone back, the kind of session speakers, I guess. So Christy, Fadi, Aja, and yeah, open the floor to questions from folks who have joined this session. We do have a question up here in case there isn't a question in this space, but I know in that you know, interest of time, definitely want to give space to folks to pose a question to any of the folks that you've got to hear from today. Maybe while folks are gathering their question, we could hear from anyone who wants to speak to this first question that's here, either an idea or lesson that you want to uplift from your work with youth.
I can share the piece that I had, well, one of the pieces that I had contributed in the toolkit was about spirit murdering and spiritual replenishment and revival in the elementary classroom. And I think one idea that I want to uplift from that piece is just recognizing that as educators, we all embody childhood trauma from schooling. If you were socialized in schooling, if you had to navigate colonial schooling. There are ways that we have normalized carcerality, that we have become desensitized to some of the oppressive logics of the classroom and how it evolves and moves. And so I think one lesson or idea that I want to uplift from my work with youth is just understanding how young people invite us into our liberation and all the ways that they resist into the classroom or within the classroom that sometimes we as educators have been socialized to punish as, transgressions against us, as disrespect against us, but really seeing it as an invitation into our own humanity, and being able to unlearn how we've been taught in schools to suppress who we are in all of the many ways that we show up in our fullness and our humanity. So that's just one thing I want to lift up.
Thank you, Fadi. So really learning from young people and learning from how their, resistance to kind of normalized classroom practices can also deepen our thinking and our practice around abolition. Oscar, do you want to jump in? And
I was about to jump in.
Please, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, similar to what Fatima just said, I think a very common idea or lesson that we do or that I try to do is to talk about how abolition doesn't look one way. It's very different for everyone, especially with youth. We invite creativity, and we always try to incorporate either art or culture or any type of significance with the work that we do in terms of abolition, in terms of education, in terms of advocating for whatever it may be. I don't know if you're all going to be able to see this, but on some of the work that we've done, our youth were actually able to all come together and create basically embodiments of their thoughts and feelings, and how they see other youth. And what these embodiments or these pictures created was like having youth with like the third eye for spirituality, having youth be highlighted different skin tones, having youth really that represents who they are and how they see themselves, but also how they sometimes feel like people see them in terms of outcasts, in terms of someone who's not normal, quote unquote, because of having a family member who's incarcerated and like what the baggage that might come from. But also seeing it as like, it doesn't matter if they're not normal, like it's okay, and it's a good highlight. And so really being able to push the narrative of abolition and the work that we do doesn't come in one way. And when we're incorporating or when we're including our youth as we should at the forefront every time, really making it okay to allow them with the creative space, with the creativeness just in general, and allowing for art and culture and everything to be at the forefront with the youth. Because a lot of the time that's not included as well. And so I don't know if you might be able to try to show it through the screen, but like this is one of the faces that that some of the youth have created. And if you're ever interested or want to learn more, like please hit me up. We could also send posters out because we have a bunch of posters with a bunch of faces and what they see incarceration as well.
I really appreciate that example, Oscar, and just also like the intention to work against the sort of kind of social narrative that's put around these systems that are structural and that we know have these deep roots in all these other violent systems that are ongoing. So thank you for giving us a tangible way of kind of giving young people a practice to kind of work through what may become like an internalized oppression, right? Chrissy, do you want to jump in and share an idea or lesson from your work?
Sure. The two things that I was thinking about that I believe I talk about in my piece that's in the toolkit with Kyle Beckham is, two things. Is one, really, I think in my work, shifting from the mentality of I'm teaching like a unit about abolition in the PIC to I'm really transforming the way that the classroom and lessons in general are really understood. So, and I think that that's a big shift for a lot of educators, is that it's not this kind of content-based piece, which it is that, but it's also about how are we transforming our practices within our classroom, and also really naming those kind of solidarities that students are demonstrating with one another as fundamentally abolitionist as well. The other thing that I think really shifted for me in teaching about the PIC and abolition is that initially, when I was teaching about it, right, I was doing all this work around like, what is the PIC and the kind of problems of the prison industrial complex, but I wasn't spending as much time on how are we cultivating that imagination of otherwise. And I think that the imagination of otherwise is actually the thing that we need the most time with, right? Because it's hard, right? And so activities like the one I shared really help us think about the tangibleness of that transformation. And so, you know, I think when I think about kind of the trajectory of my teaching about these topics over the, I don't really want to think about years now, but I think maybe over the last like 7 years, I think has been this huge shift where it's been like, okay, well, here are the issues, here's how we can name them, but also like, what do we want to build within ourselves, with one another? How are we building solidarity across communities? I think those kind of questions, you know, how do we take care of each other, this world, you know, how do we celebrate and learn through difference, right? Leaning on or borrowing from Audre Lorde there, right? I think all of that is so central to how my own work has transformed over time. And my understanding of abolition has really grown from that work with young folks and with other folks in community.
Thank you, Chrissy. I think that's so powerful and important, right? And connects back to what Fadi shared earlier, that abolition is actionable. So again, it's not just the content or the intellectual exercise, but how is it shaping our relationships in the classroom or not in the classroom, in our organizing work, right, in this moment. And I appreciate the invitation and reminder that the like building of our imaginations, that is like a muscle or a practice that we really need to like create time and space and energy towards, right? If we can't imagine a world that's otherwise, right, that's that foreclosure of our imagination is part of the way that these systems just kind of continue. Well, again, this is kind of a space to just like bring in, you know, questions folks have as you've been listening to folks share about their work. I know Aja had to leave. We thank Aja for sharing about her work, but if folks have questions, come on in, or Christy, Fadi, and Oscar, if you want to pose questions to one another as well. All right, so I see a question in the chat from Hemi asking where the recording of this will be posted at. And it's a wonderful question that I don't know the answer to, because I believe our comrades at Allied Media are hosting the recording. So maybe our AMC tech person can, oh wait. So thank you. In the chat, it says that hopefully the recording will be posted into Excel Events, which is the platform to access the conference. Go for it, Chrissy.
Yeah, so I have a question that I can ask both to Fadi and Oscar. So I'm wondering, and this is like, I think more specific to Fadi, your experience, but I think it's also relevant to yours as well, Oscar. I'm wondering about, so, you know, Fadi was a kindergarten teacher, right? And teaching as an abolitionist educator with kindergartners. And so I'm wondering about the what was kind of similar or different about doing that work with elementary school children as with like college students, right? And not even college, but like master's level folks now. And I think I'm wondering kind of similarly, Oscar, you've worked with youth, right? And you've also been working on your master's. And so I'm wondering about that. Those are big kind of different groups, right? And I'm just like wondering about I'm wondering about that, how it's looked different, how that's if that's shifted things for you. Because I've also, one of the things that I've, heard folks say is like, oh, it's so much easier to talk about abolition with adults, right? Because, or I've heard on the other hand, it's so much easier with young people because they're just like open. So, and I think both of those things are really flattening. So I'm wondering about, that's a question I'm coming up with. But if other folks who are here have questions, we'd love to hear them as well.
I think that's a great question. When I think about my work with kindergartners in particular, and then I think about the similarities or some of the connections with adults, like I think of this work as like deeply spiritual work. Like I really do believe that we are in spiritual warfare. The ways in which our spirits have been impacted by colonization shows up in how we are and who we be with one another. And I don't think that there's an age difference for that. So I want to give an example. Young people have been socialized to punish themselves and each other deeply. So when, one of the kids takes someone's pencil, they want revenge, and it goes hard and it goes deep. I want that kid thrown out of the classroom. I want them suspended. Like the extent to which they want punishment, it can be very deep, in the same ways that when I'm working with teachers, if a young person has transgressed them, it's like they want suspension. They want, they want something to be able to feel that revenge. And so that to me is a deeply spiritual, like healing issue that we have to get to. And getting to the root of that requires us to be able to understand how we too have been socialized in those ways, and opening up the space and the opportunities for us to unpack that more deeply. Now, I have heard of some teachers saying like, we'll do community circle and let's collectively decide what the punishment should be. Hell no, like that's not, to me, dealing with the root, right? So how do we continue to get to the root of the issue by opening up, like, what does harm even mean? What happens in our bodies and in our spirits when we feel harmed? What do we need? What does the other person need? How do we get to the root? And I do think that that's where transformative justice comes in. And there is no age limit for that. I think it needs to start as early as we are born into this oppressive society. And so I just think about, how often we, like the constraints of time, whether it's in a college classroom or in an elementary classroom, we are made to believe that there is not enough time. There is never enough time to be with one another. There is enough time to punish. There is enough time to throw out. There is enough time to do, but there's never enough time to be human with one another. And so I think for me, it's just important that we create the time, that we not gloss over things for the sake of efficiency, because I think that is the trick, right? It's like for us to prioritize efficiency over humanity. So yeah, that's one of the thoughts that's coming up for me right now.
I know we're running hell out of time, so I'm trying to do it quick. So ditto to what Fatima just said. I think for me, I see that a lot as well with the youth at work, but as well as with when I was doing my master's. And funny enough, I did my thesis on restorative justice and how it's implemented in Oakland Unified School District. And going a lot into what Fatima said is going into the spirituality aspect of it and see how it's embedded and how it should be embedded since the beginning. Because now we're running in this problem where people are seeing restorative justice as an alternative to suspension, as an alternative to incarceration, where it basically matches the exact same thing when it shouldn't. We have this vision of restorative justice as something that has been very westernized. It is not what it used to be. It is not where it came from, especially from indigenous groups, both in Australia and New Zealand, as well as Native indigenous tribes out here in the United States. Where it was implemented and formulated in a way so that it would fit US courts. And now it's being seen as a direct alternative, or instead of it being suspensions, now it's restorative justice or circles, and kind of making it the same weight where it's supposed to be a solution, but it really isn't. And so really kind of seeing that. And I think when it comes down to talking with adults, sometimes the creativity is not there. either. You know, I think they're so embedded in like, it's already too late to happen. Like we need some type of punishment for whatever it may be. And I think with youth, there sometimes is that slither of more creativeness or more so like willingness to engage and see what something can look like outside of what we're being taught. But I do agree with Fatima in terms of incorporating transformative justice at earlier stages and really looking at the different forms of healing or practices that have already been embedded and being critical of what that looks like and what's next.
So
Go for it.
I can do this one, no problem. So as I mentioned in the chat, if you're interested in forming a study group, please contact us at abolitionist@gmail.com to receive copies of Lessons in Liberation for your group. Discussion guides as well as a website will be available soon. There's a QR code here as well. If you would like to get connected to where you can find Lessons in Liberation from akpress.org. And we're currently giving sets of the copies away for study groups. So again, we're not interested in the kind of individual professional development model, but instead the kind of collective study and action. So if you're a part of a group, if you're connected to educators, who would like to join to form a study group, please get in touch with us at abolitionist@gmail.com. And then I think we're ready for the next slide. And Fadi, do you want to take this last slide to finish this up?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing space with us. If you want to learn more about our work, you can visit the Education for Liberation Network's website, which is www.edliberation.org. Or you can visit Critical Resistance website, which is www.criticalresistance.org. And we just appreciate y'all for sharing space with us today and freedom dreaming with us in this session. Thank you so, so much.
All right, so I think maybe we should, I was just thinking we need to talk about what happens at the end because we never talk about that. All right, sending y'all tons of love, and I'm gonna go ahead and sign off. Hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. And for folks who are in Detroit, hope you have a beautiful in-person conference. And folks online, I hope you have a beautiful online one.
Yeah, word. And thank you so much to our folks doing ASL interpretation. Really appreciate your labor and your work. Thank y'all. And to the AMC tech host that's here, thank you for doing all you're doing to bring us together. Appreciate you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, y'all. See y'all.
Bye.